Ever wondered what hell on earth looked like? Have you imagined the sheer terror of watching your city walls crumble while thousands of enemy soldiers wait to slaughter everyone you love? Number 12. The psychological warfare that broke spirits before battles began. Did you know that medieval armies would sometimes catapult severed heads over castle walls? The psychological aspect of siege warfare was just as important as the physical assault. Before a single ladder touched a wall, besiegers would employ terrifying tactics to break the will of those inside. Imagine standing on your city walls and watching as the approaching army displayed the mutilated bodies of neighboring villagers who had resisted. The message was clear: surrender or suffer the same fate. Besieging commanders understood that fear was a weapon as powerful as any trebuchet. They would often have prisoners tortured within sight of the castle walls, their screams carrying across the battlefield as a grim warning. Sometimes messengers would be sent to negotiate, but their real purpose was to report back on the defenders' food supplies, morale, and weaknesses. The sight of an enormous army setting up camp around your home would be enough to make anyone's blood run cold. Medieval armies made sure to make this spectacle as intimidating as possible. They would light thousands of campfires at night, making their forces appear even larger. War drums would beat constantly, day and night, preventing defenders from sleeping and wearing down their nerves. Psychological warfare also manifested in more gruesome ways. During the Crusades, there are accounts of besiegers catapulting diseased corpses into cities to spread illness. Imagine the horror of watching a decomposing body fly over your walls, knowing it might bring plague to your crowded streets. The Mongols were particularly known for this tactic, sometimes using the bodies of people who had died from the bubonic plague. Even the act of building siege equipment in full view of the defenders was a psychological tactic. Watching enormous towers and battering rams being constructed day by day, knowing they were intended to bring your walls down, created a sense of impending doom that could break even the strongest resolve. Number 11. Starvation that turned people into monsters. Would you eat rats, leather, or even other humans to survive? During lengthy sieges, starvation transformed ordinary people into desperate creatures willing to consume anything. When a city or castle was fully encircled, food supplies eventually dwindled to nothing. First went the luxury foods, then the staples, and finally people turned to the unthinkable. Historical records from the Siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade tell of people cooking leather shields and shoes. During the Siege of Paris by the Vikings in 885 to 886, accounts describe people eating not just dogs and cats but even dirt mixed with small amounts of flour to create a semblance of bread. Perhaps most horrifying are the accounts of cannibalism. During the Siege of Marra in 1098, Crusaders reportedly ate the flesh of their fallen Muslim enemies. In the 1315 to 1317 Great Famine, which coincided with several sieges in Europe, there are accounts of parents eating their children and children eating their parents. The besiegers knew that hunger was their ally. They would often deliberately time their sieges to begin right before harvest season, ensuring that food stores inside the castle or city were at their lowest. They would burn surrounding crops and farmland, ensuring nothing could be harvested by the defenders. The physical effects of starvation were horrific. First came constant hunger pangs, then weakness as the body consumed its own fat reserves. Eventually, muscles would begin to waste away. People became living skeletons, too weak to even defend the walls properly. Scurvy and other deficiency diseases would set in, causing teeth to fall out, wounds to stop healing, and minds to become confused and delirious. Water supplies were often targeted too. If a castle or city relied on an external spring or river, besiegers would divert it, contaminate it, or simply guard it to prevent access. Without water, people die much faster than without food. In just 3 days, dehydration can kill. The desperation for water led people to drink from sewage-contaminated sources, leading to dysentery and other diseases that killed even more efficiently than direct starvation. Number 10. Disease that ravaged both sides. Ever seen what happens when thousands of people are trapped with limited sanitation and dwindling food? During medieval sieges, diseases killed far more people than swords or arrows. Both defenders and attackers found themselves at the mercy of invisible killers. Inside besieged castles and cities, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Latrines overflowed, corpses couldn't be properly buried, and water supplies became contaminated. Dysentery, aptly nicknamed the bloody flux, was particularly common and devastating. Imagine the horror of a disease that causes violent diarrhea with blood, quickly dehydrating already hungry people. The besiegers weren't much better off. Medieval armies camping outside city walls created enormous, filthy encampments where diseases spread like wildfire. Typhus, carried by the lice that infested unwashed bodies and clothing, was particularly feared. Called camp fever, it caused high fevers, hallucinations, and often death. During the 100 Years' War, some English armies reportedly lost more men to typhus than to French weapons. The close quarters inside besieged cities made any contagious disease catastrophic. During the 1346 to 1347 siege of Kaffa, the defending Genoese watched in horror as the besieging Mongol army was ravaged by bubonic plague. The Mongols reportedly catapulted their plague-infected dead over the city walls, possibly contributing to the start of the Black Death in Europe. Medieval medical knowledge was woefully inadequate for dealing with these outbreaks. Doctors still believed in the theory of the four humors, often prescribing bloodletting that further weakened already suffering patients. Herbs and poultices might provide some symptom relief, but did little to address the underlying infections. The psychological impact of watching disease spread through confined populations was immense. Imagine watching your comrades die by the dozens each day, not from honorable battle wounds, but from lying in their own filth, delirious with fever or weakened by endless diarrhea. It's no wonder that the appearance of epidemic disease inside city walls often led to surrender talks, as defenders realized they faced annihilation whether they fought on or not. Number 9. Siege engines that turn nightmares into reality. Have you ever felt true terror as a 300-pound stone whistled through the air toward your home? Medieval siege engines were technological marvels designed for one purpose: destruction. These were not the romantically portrayed war machines of movies. They were instruments of terror that could reduce stone walls to rubble and turn human bodies into paste. The trebuchet, perhaps the most famous medieval siege weapon, operated like an enormous slingshot. Using counterweights that could exceed several tons, these machines could hurl projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over 300 yards. The psychological impact of these weapons was enormous. Defenders would watch in horror as massive stones arced through the sky, unable to predict exactly where they would land. The ground would shake with each impact, buildings would collapse, and people would be crushed. But trebuchets didn't just throw stones. Besiegers would load them with all manner of horrifying ammunition. Rotting animal carcasses spread disease. Barrels of human excrement caused illness and demoralization. Severed heads of prisoners sent clear messages. Some accounts even describe live prisoners being loaded into trebuchets and launched against walls as a grotesque form of psychological warfare. Battering rams struck fear into defenders for different reasons. These enormous logs, often metal-tipped and suspended from a wheeled frame, would rhythmically pound against gates or vulnerable sections of wall. Defenders inside would hear the constant, thunderous booming for hours or days on end, each impact bringing them closer to a breach. Some of the largest battering rams required dozens of men to operate and could eventually break through almost any gate. Siege towers were perhaps the most terrifying sight for defenders. These enormous wooden structures, sometimes reaching 100 feet tall, would be slowly pushed toward castle walls. Protected by wet hides to prevent fire, these towers would disgorge soldiers directly onto the walkways of castle walls. Imagine the dread of watching one of these behemoths creeping toward your position, knowing that when it reached the wall, dozens of fresh enemy soldiers would pour onto your defenses. The belfry, a variation of the siege tower, added another element of terror. These tall, wheeled wooden towers would be constructed out of sight, then assembled and rolled into position, often overnight. Defenders might wake to find a fully constructed tower suddenly looming over their walls, ready to discharge attackers directly into the castle. Even simple ladders were deadly effective siege instruments. Under cover of arrow fire, dozens or even hundreds might be raised against walls simultaneously. Defenders couldn't possibly repel them all, meaning that at least a few attackers would make it onto the walls, where brutal hand-to-hand combat would ensue. Number 8. Tunneling operations that brought death from below. Could you sleep at night knowing enemy soldiers might be digging right beneath your feet? One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval sieges was the knowledge that at any moment, the ground might literally disappear beneath you. Mining operations were among the most feared siege tactics, creating a constant state of paranoid vigilance among defenders. Specialized miners would dig tunnels beneath castle walls or towers. Working in complete darkness, breathing stale air, these men would hollow out chambers directly beneath foundations. These chambers would be supported by wooden beams, which would then be covered with flammable materials and set alight. As the supports burned away, walls would catastrophically collapse, creating sudden breaches that could be exploited before defenders could reorganize. The psychological impact of mining operations cannot be overstated. Defenders would desperately listen for sounds of digging, sometimes placing bowls of water on the ground to detect vibrations. The uncertainty of not knowing where or when a collapse might occur created constant stress. Some castles had countermining passageways built into their designs, allowing defenders to dig out to intercept enemy tunnels, leading to horrific underground battles fought in near-total darkness. During the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, King John's forces tunneled beneath the castle's corner tower. They filled the chamber with the fat of 40 pigs and set it ablaze, causing the tower to partially collapse. Imagine the terror of feeling the stone fortress around you suddenly shaking, cracking, and collapsing with no warning. Mining wasn't always about collapsing walls. Sometimes, tunnels were dug simply to allow attackers to emerge inside the fortifications. The shock of enemy soldiers suddenly appearing inside supposedly secure walls often caused panic and confusion among defenders. These surprise attacks could open gates from the inside, allowing the main force to enter. The work of these medieval miners was incredibly dangerous. Tunnel collapses killed many, while others suffocated from lack of air. When countermining operations met enemy tunnels, the resulting fighting was uniquely horrific, cramped, dark battles where men stabbed blindly at shadows and neither side could retreat easily. Number 7. Medieval chemical warfare that melted armor and flesh. Did you know medieval armies used chemical weapons that could burn through metal? Long before modern chemical warfare, medieval siege engineers had developed horrifying substances that could burn through flesh, armor, and even stone. Chief among these was Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that continued burning even when doused with water. The exact composition of Greek fire remains a mystery to this day, but its effects were well documented. Projected through specialized siphons or thrown in pottery containers, this sticky, burning substance adhered to whatever it touched. Imagine the terror of being hit with a substance that couldn't be extinguished as it melted through your armor and into your flesh. Ships, siege engines, and wooden structures would be reduced to ash within minutes. But Greek fire wasn't the only chemical horror of medieval sieges. Quicklime was commonly used by defenders, who would throw it down on attackers climbing ladders or breaching walls. When this powdery substance contacted the moisture in eyes or sweaty skin, it would cause chemical burns. Men hit in the face with quicklime could be permanently blinded, their eyes burning from the inside. Medieval armies also used smoke as a weapon. By burning substances like sulfur, besiegers could create choking clouds that would drive defenders from their positions. In confined spaces like gatehouses or towers, these toxic fumes could be lethal, effectively gassing the occupants when ventilation was poor. Even more diabolical were poison smokes made from various toxic plants and minerals. Arsenical compounds, when burned, release highly toxic fumes that can kill through inhalation. Historical accounts describe defenders abandoning otherwise defensible positions because the air had been rendered unbreathable by these primitive chemical attacks. Boiling oil, while less common than depicted in movies, oil was expensive, was indeed used when available. The effects were horrific. The hot liquid would seep into armor, continuing to burn the flesh underneath long after the initial contact. More common were boiling water or heated sand, which would seep through armor joints and cause excruciating burns. Perhaps most terrifying was the use of sewage and animal blood as biological weapons. Containers filled with human waste and diseased matter would be catapulted over walls, contaminating water supplies and causing outbreaks of disease. The psychological impact of being showered with excrement and rotting matter was also significant, breaking morale and spreading illness among tightly packed defenders. Number 6. The fate of survivors when walls finally fell. What happened when castle walls finally broke? When defenses finally crumbled, the real nightmare began. Medieval warfare operated under a set of unwritten rules that determined the fate of those inside captured cities and castles. These rules were brutal, with consequences that varied based on how long the siege had lasted and how many attackers had died. If a city surrendered before a siege began in earnest, the civilians might be spared and the defending soldiers allowed to leave with their lives, if not their possessions. This was the best-case scenario, as it saved the attacker time and resources. But if defenders rejected initial surrender demands, the terms would worsen dramatically. If a city surrendered after a siege had begun but before the walls were breached, civilians might still be spared, but defending soldiers could face imprisonment or execution. Their fate often depended on their value as hostages or ransoms. Common soldiers might be killed outright, while knights and nobles would be held for payment. The worst scenario, one that happened all too frequently, occurred when a city was taken by force after a long siege. The medieval concept of storm meant that attackers who had to take a city by direct assault felt entitled to 3 days of unopposed looting, rape, and killing. This wasn't just random violence, it was an established convention of warfare, understood by both attackers and defenders. The sack of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099 demonstrates this brutal reality. After the city fell, crusaders slaughtered thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants regardless of age or gender. Contemporary accounts describe blood running ankle-deep in the streets and soldiers wading through gore. Similar scenes played out across medieval Europe and the Middle East whenever major cities fell after prolonged resistance. Women faced particularly horrific fates. Mass rape was common practice after a successful siege, considered part of the rewards for the victorious army. High-born women might be taken as forced wives or hostages, while common women faced brutal gang rapes before often being killed or abandoned. Children weren't spared either. While younger children might sometimes be taken as servants or slaves, older boys who could potentially bear arms were frequently killed outright to prevent future resistance. During the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, when asked how to tell Catholic from Cathar in the captured city of Béziers, the papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." While the quote may be apocryphal, it reflects the mentality that often prevailed. Even religious figures and places of worship provided little sanctuary. Churches and temples filled with refugees were frequently violated, with horrific massacres occurring in supposedly sacred spaces. During the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, Latin crusaders desecrated Orthodox churches, stealing relics and melting down sacred objects for their gold and silver. Number 5. Weapons designed specifically for wall fighting. Ever seen a weapon designed solely to pull a man off a castle wall to fall to his death? Medieval siege combat developed specialized implements of death that would make modern soldiers pale. These weren't normal battlefield weapons, they were created specifically for the unique horror of fighting along narrow walkways high above the ground. The billhook, with its curved blade attached to a long pole, was perfect for pulling defenders off battlements. Imagine fighting for your life while an enemy below uses this weapon to snag your clothing or armor, suddenly yanking you off balance and over the edge to fall dozens of feet onto hard ground or sharpened stakes. Other pole weapons like halberds combined multiple killing methods: a spear point for thrusting, an axe blade for chopping, and a hook for pulling defenders off balance. Fighting on the narrow confines of castle walls created unique horrors. With walls sometimes only a few feet wide, there was literally nowhere to retreat. One wrong step meant falling to your death. Heavily armored knights, formidable on an open battlefield, could become vulnerabilities on walls. One successful push could send them plummeting, where they might survive the fall only to lie helplessly in their heavy armor, unable to rise as enemies approached to finish them off. Sieges also saw the development of early hand grenades and incendiary devices. Pottery containers filled with Greek fire, quicklime, or other combustibles would be thrown at clustered defenders. In the confined spaces of gatehouses and towers, these primitive explosives could be devastating, filling small areas with fire or caustic chemicals that left no escape. The crossbow became particularly feared during sieges. Unlike traditional bows, crossbows required minimal training and could be fired from behind cover. Their heavy bolts could penetrate most armor at close range. During sieges, crossbowmen would set up in windows and crenellations, picking off exposed defenders. Just showing your head above a parapet could mean taking a bolt through the eye or throat. Spring-powered harpoon guns, while rare, were sometimes used in sieges. These weapons fired barbed projectiles attached to ropes that could drag defenders off walls. Even more terrifying were early firearms like the hand cannon, which appeared in European sieges by the late medieval period. These primitive guns were wildly inaccurate but created tremendous noise and smoke, adding psychological terror to their lethal potential. For close combat on walls, specialized short weapons became essential. Long swords were often impractical in the confined spaces of wall fighting. Instead, short swords, warhammers, and daggers became the preferred weapons. The warhammer was particularly effective against armored opponents, as its concentrated force could dent helmets and crush skulls even through metal protection. Number 4. The horrifying toll on the surrounding countryside. Do you realize that peasants miles away from a siege might still starve to death because of it? The devastation of medieval sieges extended far beyond castle walls. Armies pursuing a siege needed constant supplies, and they often acquired these by systematically stripping the surrounding countryside bare through foraging, or more accurately, organized plundering. When a medieval army arrived to besiege a castle or city, one of its first actions was to secure its own food supply by taking everything edible from nearby towns and villages. This wasn't just grabbing a few chickens, it was comprehensive confiscation of grain stores, livestock, vegetables, fruit, and anything else that could feed soldiers. For local peasants, this often meant complete destitution and starvation, even if they weren't directly attacked. The policy of Shevchy, deliberately devastating the countryside around an enemy stronghold, was standard practice during the 100 Years' War. English armies would systematically burn crops, destroy mills, kill livestock they couldn't take, and tear down barns and houses. The goal was twofold: to feed their own army and to destroy the economic base of their enemy. The human cost was considered irrelevant. During the Siege of Calais 1346 to 1347, Edward III's forces stripped bare a huge area of northern France to sustain their 11-month operation. Contemporary chronicles describe peasants eating roots, grass, and even each other as famine took hold in regions far from the actual fighting. Similarly, during the various sieges of the Hussite Wars in the 1420s, areas of Bohemia were so thoroughly devastated that they remained depopulated for generations. Water sources would be polluted or diverted, ensuring that even if some food remained, the basics for survival were compromised. Wells would be filled with carcasses or human remains, making water undrinkable for months or years. Rivers would be dammed or diverted to deny their use to both the besieged and surrounding communities. The environmental impact was long-lasting. Armies needed enormous amounts of wood for siege engines, campfires, and shelters. Entire forests could be cleared around major sieges, leading to soil erosion and changes in local ecosystems that lasted centuries. During the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, the surrounding landscape was so thoroughly stripped of trees that the area remained relatively barren for generations. Disease spread from siege camps into civilian populations with devastating effects. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses carried by soldiers would ripple outward through refugee populations, killing many more people than the actual fighting. These epidemics could continue long after the armies had moved on. Perhaps most devastating was the long-term economic collapse. A region subjected to a major siege might take decades to recover economically. Infrastructure like mills, bridges, and irrigation systems, often destroyed during sieges, represented generations of work. Their loss could plunge entire regions into extended poverty even after the immediate crisis had passed. Number 3. The special hell reserved for traitors and spies. Have you ever wondered why medieval people were so obsessed with creating particularly cruel executions? During sieges, the treatment of captured spies and traitors reached levels of brutality almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. These weren't just killings, they were elaborately staged public spectacles designed to deter others. When defenders caught someone attempting to communicate with the besiegers or sabotage defenses, the punishment would be public, prolonged, and excruciatingly painful. Common methods included being hung from the walls in full view of the besieging army, often in iron cages where the traitor would slowly die of exposure and dehydration over days. Imagine the psychological impact on both sides, the besiegers watching one of their agents suffer while the defenders witnessed a stark warning about collaboration. Being flayed alive, having one's skin peeled off while still conscious, was another fate that might await captured spies. This extraordinarily painful process would be performed publicly, with the victim's screams serving as a warning to others considering betrayal. The skin might then be nailed to the city gates as a gruesome trophy and warning. Drawing and quartering, perhaps the most infamous execution method, was often reserved for traitors. The condemned would be dragged through streets behind a horse, then hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, disemboweled with their entrails burned before their eyes, beheaded, and their body divided into 4 parts to be displayed in different locations. Each step was carefully designed to maximize both physical pain and public humiliation. Besieging forces treated captured defenders who had broken surrender terms with similar brutality. When King John captured Rochester Castle in 1215 after a lengthy siege, he initially planned to hang all the defenders. He was only dissuaded because a captured noble pointed out that his own men might be treated similarly in the future. Instead, only the crossbowmen among the defenders were executed, their hands chopped off as punishment for having raised them against the king. Boiling in oil or water was another execution method sometimes used for traitors during sieges. This exceptionally painful death would be carried out in the town square, with the victim slowly lowered into the heated liquid. Death came not from drowning but from the progressive cooking of the flesh, with survival sometimes lasting for horrifying minutes or even hours. Even successful spies lived in constant fear. If discovered after completing their mission, they might face even worse treatment, with their families sometimes punished alongside them. During the Byzantine sieges, there are accounts of captured spies having their eyes put out with hot irons, their tongues cut out, and their hamstrings severed, leaving them blind, mute, and immobile but alive as permanent examples. The psychological operations aspect of these punishments cannot be overstated. They weren't just about punishing one individual, but about maintaining control through fear. In the pressure cooker environment of a besieged city, where food was scarce and surrender might seem increasingly attractive, these graphic demonstrations of the consequences of betrayal served to maintain compliance through terror. Number 2. Cannibalism and the collapse of social order. Would you eat human flesh if you were starving? When sieges stretched from weeks to months, the most fundamental taboos could collapse. Historical records from numerous medieval sieges document the progression from hunger to desperation to unthinkable acts as social norms disintegrated within besieged walls. The Siege of Paris by Vikings in 885 to 886 led to reports of cannibalism among the starving population. As the siege dragged on, first came the slaughter of all animals, not just horses and livestock, but pets, rats, and even insects. When these were gone, people turned to boiling leather from shoes and belts to extract any nutrition. The final step was the consumption of the dead, first starting with those who had already died from starvation or disease, but sometimes progressing to murder for food. During the First Crusade siege of Myra in 1098, contemporary chronicles record that crusaders, themselves starving outside the walls, resorted to eating the bodies of dead enemies. Radolf of Caen wrote that in Myra our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots, they impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled. While some historians debate whether these accounts were exaggerated, similar reports emerge from numerous other sieges. The social breakdown inside besieged cities followed predictable patterns. Initial solidarity would give way to hoarding, theft, and eventually violence over dwindling resources. The wealthy might maintain private food stores while the poor starved in the streets. Religious institutions that normally cared for the destitute would find their own supplies exhausted. Municipal authorities often established strict rationing systems, but these inevitably collapsed as supplies dwindled to nothing. Children were particularly vulnerable during extended sieges. Historical accounts frequently mention parents abandoning children they could no longer feed, or even more horrifically, instances of parents consuming their own children. During the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, although outside our medieval timeframe, similar accounts exist from medieval sieges. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded a mother cooking and eating her own infant, a story repeated with variations in multiple medieval siege chronicles. Within the confines of besieged cities, murder rates would skyrocket as desperation took hold. People would kill for scraps of food or even on mere suspicion that others were hoarding supplies. During the Siege of Calais, chronicles record that the elderly and infirm were expelled from the city to conserve food for those who could fight, effectively condemning them to death at the hands of besiegers or from exposure. The psychological trauma of witnessing such social collapse left lasting scars on medieval communities. Cities that had experienced prolonged sieges often struggled with social cohesion for generations afterward. Trust between neighbors, a fundamental aspect of medieval community life, could be permanently damaged by the memory of what people had done when pushed to the edge of survival. Number 1. The almost certain death that awaited common soldiers. Did you know your chances of surviving a medieval siege were worse than flipping a coin? For the average soldier on either side of the walls, siege warfare was a virtual death sentence, not primarily from heroic combat, but from disease, accidents, and the myriad horrifying ways men died when large groups fought in confined spaces. For attacking soldiers, the moment of assault on castle walls was particularly lethal. Imagine climbing a tall ladder while wearing armor, with defenders above pouring boiling water, hot sand, or burning oil onto you. Those who managed to reach the top of the walls would face well-rested defenders fighting with the advantage of higher ground. Many attackers would be simply pushed from the ladders to fall dozens of feet to their deaths, often landing on their comrades below. Siege towers presented their own lethal challenges. These wooden structures, vulnerable to fire despite wet hides covering them, could become death traps if ignited while full of soldiers. Men would be forced to choose between burning alive inside or jumping to their deaths. During the Siege of Acre in the Third Crusade, hundreds of crusaders died when their siege tower caught fire and collapsed. The casualties from direct combat were only a fraction of total deaths. Living conditions in siege camps were abysmal. Men slept in mud, drank contaminated water, and lived in close proximity to open latrines. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, killed countless soldiers through dehydration after causing severe, bloody diarrhea. So common was this ailment that medieval armies expected to lose up to a third of their strength to it during extended campaigns. For defenders, death might come more slowly, but was no less certain in prolonged sieges. Crowded conditions inside walls accelerated disease transmission. Food and water shortages led to malnutrition that made men vulnerable to infections they might otherwise have survived. Wounds that would be minor in other circumstances became lethal as lack of proper food prevented healing. The psychology of being trapped influenced mortality as well. Contemporary accounts describe defenders becoming reckless due to the psychological pressure of confinement and inevitable defeat. Suicide was not uncommon among soldiers who could see no escape and feared the consequences of capture. During the siege of Masada, again outside our medieval period but illustrative, the entire defending force committed mass suicide rather than face capture. When walls were finally breached, the slaughter was often total. Attacking soldiers having endured months of hardship, disease, and watching their comrades die typically showed little mercy. Common soldiers who had defended a prolonged siege could expect execution if captured. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, after the city fell, crusaders killed nearly every defender regardless of attempts to surrender. Even surrender rarely guaranteed survival for common soldiers. While nobles might be ransomed, common men-at-arms had little value alive. After the surrender of Calais in 1347, Edward III demanded that 6 prominent citizens be handed over for execution. They were ultimately spared, but hundreds of common defenders were simply expelled from the city to face starvation in the devastated countryside. For those who somehow survived, the physical and mental scars were permanent. Medieval medicine had no effective treatments for severe burns from boiling oil, crushed limbs from fallen stones, or puncture wounds from arrows and crossbow bolts. Men who lived often did so with crippling injuries, unable to work or fight again, reduced to begging or depending on family support if they were fortunate enough to have it. Were medieval sieges the most horrific form of warfare ever devised? Could anything be more terrifying than watching your walls slowly crumble while knowing what awaited you and your family if they fell?